Date: May 8, 1945, Berlin. The city was not a city anymore. It was a skeleton made of ash and smoke. The air smelled of gasoline, plaster, and fear. In the ruins behind the Reich Chancellery, a man in a black SS uniform crouched beside a small fire. His name was Karl Reiner, Obersturmführer, 32 years old, once proud, once unstoppable. Now he was feeding his past to the flames. His papers, his medals, even the photograph of himself standing next to a smiling general whose name he dared not remember aloud. Around him, the ruins of Berlin were quiet except for the distant coughing of dying engines and the whisper of crows that had learned that men no longer ruled the city. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted exactly 12 years and 4 months. For men like Reiner, it was not a fall from grace. It was an extinction. He watched the flames consume his insignia and thought about how only a few months ago he had been giving speeches to new recruits about loyalty, duty, and the destiny of the German race. He had believed it then. Maybe he still did, in some small buried way. But belief was a luxury for men who still had homes. Behind him, a column of smoke rose from what used to be Wilhelmstrasse. Someone had hung a white bedsheet from a shattered balcony, though it was hard to tell if it was a surrender flag or just another ghost. Across Germany, across Europe, the same scene repeated in millions of variations. The elite of Hitler's armies, the Waffen-SS, the paratroopers, the tank commanders, had become fugitives in their own land. They had been called the most disciplined soldiers in the world, the Iron Heart of the Reich. Now they begged for bread from villagers and hid from the armies they once despised. Over 8 million German soldiers were prisoners of the Allies, and those who still roamed free lived as shadows among ruins. For 12 years, they had been the executioners of Hitler's will. On the 13th, they became its victims. Reiner's mind wandered back to the last order he'd received before Berlin fell: hold your position. Fight to the last man. He had laughed when the messenger brought it. The last man? Who decides when that is? The messenger hadn't answered. That silence stayed with him longer than the gunfire. He didn't know if it was obedience or exhaustion that made him burn his papers rather than himself. Around that same hour, in the bunker below, Adolf Hitler had already done the latter. Outside Berlin, men like Ernst Vogel, once a major in the Panzer Division, Das Reich, tried to make sense of surrender. Vogel had commanded tanks through the fields of France and the forests of Ukraine. He had watched villages burn and cities surrender. He had been decorated for bravery, though he sometimes wondered if bravery was just another word for survival. Now he stood in a muddy camp in Denmark, stripped of rank, waiting for orders from a corporal in a British uniform. "War's over," the corporal had said, as if that was something you could turn off like a radio. The war was over for the politicians and the generals who signed papers in neat handwriting. For men like Vogel and Reiner, it was only the beginning of another kind of battle, the one for identity. Who were they now, if not soldiers? The enemy had not only destroyed their armies but their sense of purpose. Some clung to the lie that the Führer still lived. Some swore they would fight again, somewhere, somehow. But most simply stared at the ground, dazed, hungry, and strangely relieved. Among them was Lucas Brenner, barely 20, who had joined the Waffen-SS in 1944. He had fought for 6 months before being captured outside Prague. When interrogators asked why he fought, he had no answer. "Because everyone did," he finally said. The interrogator wrote something down and left the room. Brenner sat alone for hours, realizing for the first time that obedience could outlive the man who commanded it. It was hard for the world to comprehend how fast the transformation had happened. Just a year earlier, the German army had occupied nearly all of continental Europe. Their songs, their symbols, their flags had been everywhere. They had believed themselves invincible. Their propaganda films had shown them as the future of humanity, strong, efficient, destined to rule. And now, they were sleeping in barns, stealing potatoes, and praying to not be recognized by the same civilians they once ordered around. The contrast was grotesque and, in a dark way, almost poetic. Reiner remembered one of his officers once saying, "History is written by the victors." He hadn't realized at the time that it was also erased by them. The Allies were already rewriting Germany's story, not as a nation of warriors, but as a nation of criminals. To be German was to be guilty. To be an SS man was to be cursed. That night, Reiner walked through the ruins and saw a boy, maybe 15, wearing a Hitler Youth armband, crying beside a dead horse. The boy saluted him weakly, as if habit could still replace hope. Reiner didn't return the salute. He just handed him a piece of bread and kept walking. The gesture felt both meaningless and holy. In the days after surrender, the real nightmare began: the silence. No gunfire, no speeches, no marching bands. Just the creak of wagons, the murmur of prisoners, and the wind through empty buildings. Entire battalions vanished into forests. Officers disguised themselves as farmers. Rumors spread that Allied soldiers were shooting SS men on sight. Some took their own lives rather than face capture. Others hid their tattoos, cut their uniforms into rags, and swore they had never believed in anything. Historians would later call it the German Twilight, a time when an entire nation wandered between denial and despair. The Allies filmed the concentration camps, forcing German civilians to walk through them to see what their elite had done. The footage shocked the world and terrified the soldiers, who now realized what their cause looked like in truth. Vogel saw those films months later, during an Allied interrogation. He watched the images of emaciated prisoners and mass graves. He said nothing, but inside something cracked. He had told himself he was fighting for order, for defense, for duty. But the screen showed only horror. "We didn't know," he whispered. The officer across from him looked at him coldly. "You didn't ask," he said. And yet, not all reacted with remorse. Some clung to the myth that it was all Allied propaganda, that Germany had been betrayed, that Hitler had been right about everything except timing. Reiner met a group of such men weeks later while hiding in Bavaria. They spoke of escape routes, of secret bases in the Alps, of returning when the West and East turned on each other. Reiner listened in silence. He no longer believed in the resurrection of the Reich. But he couldn't bring himself to argue. Belief, even delusion, gave these men purpose. He envied them for it. In June 1945, the British began transferring prisoners to larger camps. Reiner was caught during a routine patrol, his fake papers insufficiently convincing. He was marched with hundreds of others to a temporary enclosure outside Lübeck, open fields surrounded by wire. They slept in mud, ate thin soup, and waited. The guards were polite but distant. "You'll all be processed soon," one said. No one knew what that meant. At night, Reiner lay awake listening to the murmurs around him, men reciting prayers, songs, names of the dead. Someone joked that the Allies should give them shovels and let them rebuild Europe since they'd been so good at destroying it. The camp erupted in a brief laugh, bitter, hollow, but human. Even defeat couldn't completely erase humor. By July, Vogel and Brenner were in similar camps across the continent. The stories were all the same: hunger, boredom, rumors. Some men were taken away for questioning and never returned. Others began writing letters home that no one answered. Months turned into a haze of waiting. They were no longer soldiers, not yet civilians, just men suspended in history, unsure which side of it they would end up on. Back in Berlin, the city began its slow rebirth. The Red Army occupied the east, the Allies the west. Posters appeared declaring denazification. The word itself sounded like an operation, as if you could surgically remove ideology from a people. But ideology was a stubborn parasite. It lingered in whispers, in nostalgia, in the secret pride of survival. For Reiner, Vogel, and Brenner, and millions like them, the war had ended, but peace had not yet begun. They carried the weight of their choices, their obedience, their silence. Some would find ways to justify it. Others would spend their lives trying to forget. And as the summer sun rose over the ruins, they all wondered the same thing: what would become of Hitler's chosen men now that the world no longer had a place for them? That question hung in the air, unspoken, as if even history itself hesitated to answer. Because what came next, the trials, the escapes, the reinventions, would not only decide their fate but shape the moral shadow of the entire century. The first snow of winter fell on the camp outside Lübeck in November 1945. It came quietly, like an intruder afraid to wake the ghosts already sleeping there. The prisoners stood by the fence, their faces turned upward, watching flakes settle on barbed wire and mud. To them, the snow was neither beautiful nor cruel. It was simply proof that time was still moving, something they had begun to doubt. Among them stood Karl Reiner, thinner now, his once sharp eyes dulled by routine and hunger. He had survived the bombings, the chaos, the interrogations, and yet, this stillness unnerved him most of all. War had given him orders. Peace gave him nothing. Every morning, British guards called names from a list and marched a few dozen men out of the compound. Some returned days later, others vanished forever. The camp whispered explanations, trials, deportations, labor details. The truth depended on who you asked. Reiner stopped asking. He spent his days repairing fences or hauling firewood, his nights staring at the stars as if searching for something that might still justify all that had been done. Sometimes he thought about Lucas Brenner, the boy he had seen in the transport column months earlier. He wondered if the boy had survived, if he still believed in anything. Across the border in southern Germany, Ernst Vogel was one of the lucky prisoners. The Americans had decided that officers like him could be of use in reconstruction. They gave him clean clothes, a typewriter, and a desk inside a requisition schoolhouse. His job was to help compile records, lists of German officers, documents about units, inventories of equipment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was cataloging the ruins of the very machine he had once commanded. Still, it gave him purpose, and that was a rare currency in those days. At night, Vogel stayed in a small room behind the office. The walls were lined with children's drawings, crude tanks and stick figures holding flags. The ghosts of innocence, he thought. Sometimes, he would look at his reflection in the dark window and see not himself, but fragments of uniforms, medals, faces of men who had followed his orders to their deaths. The Americans treated him with a measured politeness, as if he were both useful and contaminated. They asked him questions about tactics, logistics, morale, and he answered with the discipline of a soldier who no longer believed in anything but accuracy. Yet accuracy didn't bring peace. It brought memory, and memory was the cruelest enemy. Each document reminded him of a time when he had power, when the world made sense through the language of strategy and maps. Now he was just another defeated man helping his conquerors understand how efficiently his country had destroyed itself. Meanwhile, Lucas Brenner's story took a harsher turn. The Allies had transferred him from a Czech prison to an American-run camp near Nuremberg. There, rumors spread that high-ranking SS officers would face trial, the Nuremberg trials, they called them. The younger soldiers whispered about them with fear and fascination. Brenner was too young to be accused of anything, but guilt had no age in those days. He spent hours staring at the barbed wire, feeling the invisible weight of crimes he hadn't committed but had somehow inherited. The camp chaplain, an old man named Father O'Connell, used to visit the prisoners. He spoke German with an Irish accent and carried himself like someone who had seen too much death to hate anyone anymore. Confession isn't about forgiveness, he told them once. It's about remembering honestly. Brenner didn't understand then, but something in the priest's voice, calm, tired, human, stayed with him. One evening, O'Connell found Brenner sitting alone behind the barracks, carving something into the wood with a nail. "What are you writing?" the priest asked. "Nothing," Brenner said. "Just a name." "Yours?" "No. My brother's. He died in 43. "Was he a soldier?" "Yes." "Then you share his burden." Brenner looked up. "Even if I didn't kill anyone?" The priest sighed. "Especially then." That sentence haunted him for years. Back in Lübeck, the British began releasing selected prisoners. Men with no criminal records, men who could be rehabilitated. Reiner was among those chosen. They gave him a slip of paper and a few coins, told him to report to a labor office in Hamburg. Freedom felt less like salvation and more like exile. The world outside the fence was colder, emptier. Villages looked at returning soldiers with suspicion or disgust. Mothers pulled their children closer. In the eyes of civilians, the uniform, even invisible now, still clung to their skin. Reiner found work unloading cargo at the docks. His hands cracked from salt and frost, but at least the labor kept him from thinking. The Allies paid little, but enough for a room and bread. Some nights, he went to a tavern where men like him gathered, unshaven, hollow-eyed veterans nursing cheap beer and dangerous nostalgia. They talked about old campaigns, about how the Russians would soon fight the Americans, how Germany would rise again when both sides tore each other apart. Reiner listened, silent, not because he believed, but because silence was easier than argument. One night, a stranger approached their table. He was clean, confident, his accent southern. "You men fought well," the stranger said softly. "The fatherland may be divided, but our spirit isn't. There's work for patriots who can keep quiet." The table fell silent. Everyone knew what he meant. The networks forming across Europe, helping former SS officers escape Allied prosecution. They called it the Ratlin. The man left a card with an address in Munich. "For those who refuse to live as slaves," he said before disappearing into the snow. Reiner pocketed the card but never used it. Still, he kept it, as if proof that he could choose rebellion anytime he wanted. Meanwhile, Vogel's usefulness was nearing its end. The Americans had enough reports. The paperwork was nearly finished. One afternoon, his superior handed him a sealed envelope. "You're free to go, Major. But remember, freedom isn't innocence." Vogel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He left the office and walked for hours, past fields littered with rusting tanks and burned-out trucks. Freedom, he realized, was a strange thing when no one waited for you. He eventually returned to his hometown near Stuttgart. The place was unrecognizable, houses leveled, streets renamed, neighbors vanished. His parents were dead. His wife had remarried a man who'd survived by working for the Americans. She looked at him like one might look at a ghost. "You should leave," she said quietly. "People talk." So he left. He found temporary shelter in a monastery that had been converted into a refugee center. The monks gave him a bed, a bowl of soup, and silence. For the first time since the war began, he prayed, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Why had he done what he did? Why had they all? Was it truly belief, or simply fear of being no one? In the same month, Brenner was released from Nuremberg. The chaplain had written him a recommendation letter, calling him a soul not yet hardened by ideology. He returned to Munich, working as a clerk for the city's reconstruction bureau. But he carried the priest's words inside him, "Remember honestly." Every day, he passed posters demanding citizens report war criminals. And every day he wondered if turning himself in for belief would count. It was in Munich, in the winter of 1946, that Brenner met Reiner again. They recognized each other instantly, not from memory, but from the shared expression of men who had lost the right to feel proud. They began talking over cheap coffee in a corner cafe. Reiner spoke little, Brenner listened more. Over time, their conversations grew deeper, about guilt, survival, faith. "You were an officer," Brenner said once. "Do you ever think about what you'd do differently?" Reiner thought for a long moment before answering. "I'd ask more questions. That's all. Just ask." Their fragile friendship became a kind of salvation. In each other, they found someone who understood the language of shame. Yet even then, shadows lingered. Former comrades sometimes approached Reiner with offers to join secret groups, to help preserve the true Germany. He always refused, but each refusal left him uneasy, as if he were betraying something that had once been holy. In early 1947, news spread that the Nuremberg executions had begun. The world cheered, Germany stayed silent. Reiner and Brenner listened to the radio in their rented room as the announcer listed names: Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel. Justice, the Allies called it. But to them, it felt like another kind of ending, one that finally made denial impossible. Vogel read about it in a newspaper he found on a monastery bench. He folded it neatly, then stared at the horizon. The world was moving forward, rebuilding. But for him, and for thousands like him, the future was a locked door. They had built their identities on obedience, and now obedience had no place to belong. By spring, each man, Reiner, Vogel, Brenner, stood at a crossroads. Reiner had a chance to disappear through the Ratlin, to Argentina or Spain, under a new name. Vogel was offered work in the new German police force, helping rebuild order under Allied supervision. Brenner had begun writing letters to Father O'Connell, though he never sent them. None of them knew it yet, but their choices in that fragile year would decide more than their survival. They would decide whether Germany's ghosts would stay buried or rise again in a different form. And as the rivers thawed and the first green returned to the shattered landscape, one truth became clear: peace was not the absence of war, it was the test of what war had left behind. By the summer of 1947, Germany was breathing again, but every breath carried the taste of ash. Cities were rebuilding, trains were running, and laughter occasionally returned to cafes, though it always sounded a little guilty. The occupying powers called it denazification, but for many it felt more like erasure. Streets once named after generals now bore the names of poets. Statues vanished overnight. Schoolbooks changed their language. And in the minds of men like Karl Reiner, Ernst Vogel, and Lucas Brenner, the question lingered: if the world was rewriting the past, what place was left for those who had lived it? Karl Reiner found work with a construction company outside Frankfurt. The labor was steady, the pay modest, and the foreman didn't ask questions about anyone's past, a rare mercy in those days. He liked the rhythm of rebuilding, the precision of hammer and stone. It was physical, simple, and silent. But every wall he raised seemed to whisper the same thing: you cannot build fast enough to forget. Nights were harder. He lived in a boarding house filled with other veterans, men who snored loudly and spoke softly, as though words might bring the past crawling back. Sometimes, after work, he walked along the riverbank, where refugees huddled in tents made from old uniforms. The irony wasn't lost on him. He carried in his pocket a letter from a man he didn't know, a recruiter for the Rattlin, offering him passage to Argentina. The letter promised a new beginning for honorable Germans. He'd read it a dozen times, each word both tempting and poisonous. He'd even gone as far as the railway station once, ticket in hand, before turning back. Something in him refused to run, though he couldn't say if it was courage or exhaustion. Ernst Vogel, meanwhile, was wearing a new uniform, the dark green of the fledgling West German police force. It was 1948, and the Americans were reorganizing local security to fight the growing communist influence from the East. Vogel was considered valuable, a disciplined officer who understood both command and control. The irony was not lost on him either. Once, he had sworn loyalty to Hitler, now he reported to a U.S. colonel. The words changed, but the structure remained eerily familiar. Orders flowed down, obedience climbed up. He told himself he was serving a better cause this time, but doubt crept in like damp through stone. The police force was filled with men like him, former officers, clerks, administrators, all pretending they were reborn. Yet behind closed doors, in smoke-filled rooms, old loyalties still flickered. Germany needs strength, not shame, one of his colleagues said over drinks. Vogel didn't disagree out loud, but the phrase unsettled him. He'd heard it before too many times, always as a prelude to ruin. So he stayed. The uniform gave him purpose. Without it, he feared he'd dissolve entirely into memory. His superiors noticed his efficiency and began trusting him with delicate assignments, monitoring border activity, investigating underground movements. One such report led him to a rumor, a network helping former SS officers escape to South America. The name on one of the intercepted letters caught his eye. It was familiar: Karl Reiner. The discovery hit him like a ghost. He hadn't seen Reiner since before the war ended, but he remembered the man, intelligent, composed, pragmatic. The thought that Reiner might be caught up in something illegal bothered him deeply. He requested the assignment personally, under the pretense of moral interest. His superior approved without hesitation. Meanwhile, Lucas Brenner had found a strange kind of peace in writing. By 1948, he was keeping journals, long, rambling reflections on guilt, belief, and the burden of silence. He didn't write for anyone, he barely wrote for himself. It was simply the only way to keep the memories from festering. He still worked for the Reconstruction Bureau, translating documents and coordinating aid. But his real labor was inward. He often thought of Father O'Connell's words: Remember honestly. That phrase had become both anchor and torment. The more he remembered, the less he could live comfortably in the present. He wrote about the boy he'd seen die on the Eastern Front, about the old man he'd arrested for speaking against the regime, about the cheers in the streets when Hitler's speeches echoed through the radio. He wrote, then burned the pages. Writing was confession, burning was absolution. In early 1949, Brenner attended a small lecture at the University of Munich, given by an American historian studying post-war German psychology. The speaker talked about collective guilt, how entire societies carried scars from their moral choices. Brenner left before it ended. The idea of collective guilt felt too neat, too academic. Guilt, he thought, was personal. It wore faces, not flags. It was on one of his train rides home that fate intertwined the three men again. Vogel, traveling on police duty, recognized Brenner from across the carriage. The last time they'd seen each other had been in passing during the war, when Vogel was an officer and Brenner still a teenage recruit. They exchanged cautious greetings, spoke of work, of peace, of how strange it felt to live among ruins pretending to be a nation. When Brenner mentioned that he knew Reiner, that they'd met years earlier in Munich, Vogel's eyes sharpened. He's still in Germany? He asked too quickly. Brenner hesitated before answering. Last I heard, yes. Why? Vogel deflected, saying only that Reiner's name had surfaced in a report. They parted amicably, but both men were uneasy afterward, as though the past had suddenly remembered them. Weeks later, Vogel traveled to Frankfurt to find Reiner. Officially, he was there on police business. Unofficially, he wasn't sure what he wanted: justice, closure, or simply conversation. He found Reiner in the yard of a half-finished building, sleeves rolled up, sweat streaking the dust on his face. They stared at each other for a long moment, two soldiers without armies. I heard you're rebuilding the country, Vogel said. And I heard you're guarding it, Reiner replied. There was no hostility in his voice, only weariness. They sat by the scaffolding, sharing a cigarette in silence. The world around them buzzed with new beginnings. Cranes creaked, hammers rang, children's laughter echoed through alleyways. Yet between them, the air was heavy with ghosts. Vogel finally spoke. There's talk you're connected to an escape network. Names, routes, money. Is it true? Reiner smiled faintly. If it were, do you think I'd still be here? He flicked ash into the dirt. They offered me a way out. I didn't take it. Why not? Vogel asked. Because I've run enough. And because someone has to stay and remember what happened, even if no one wants to hear it. Vogel studied him, unsure whether to admire or pity him. You know they won't let us forget, he said. Reiner nodded. But maybe we deserve that. Vogel left that day conflicted. The official report he filed mentioned no substantial evidence, and the matter was quietly closed. But the meeting stayed with him. He'd expected guilt or defiance. Instead, he'd found something rarer: acceptance, even peace. That night, Vogel couldn't sleep. He walked through the empty streets, past posters announcing the formation of the new Federal Republic of Germany. The nation was being reborn, and he was part of its skeleton. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the new Germany was being built atop the unburied bones of the old one. In the months that followed, Vogel began noticing cracks in his own department. Some officers openly sympathized with the old regime, others were quietly on foreign payrolls. Corruption, ideology, opportunism, all still alive, wearing new uniforms. He tried to report it, but his superiors urged discretion. It was then he understood: peace didn't cleanse, it merely rearranged the dirt. Meanwhile, Brenner's internal war deepened. His journals grew darker, his reflections sharper. He wrote about his generation: boys taught to kill before they learned to think, then told to feel shame for surviving. He began sending anonymous essays to small local newspapers, signing them only as a German soldier. Some were published, stirring quiet debates in beer halls and cafes. A few letters arrived in response, some grateful, others furious. But Brenner didn't care. For the first time, his words felt useful. Then, in late 1949, he received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single line written in familiar, neat handwriting: You cannot heal what you refuse to name. There was no signature, but he knew it was from Reiner. The letter reignited something in him, not guilt, but resolve. He decided to visit Reiner in Frankfurt. When he arrived, he found the man changed, older, quieter, but somehow lighter, as if he'd finally made peace with the ghosts that haunted him. They spoke late into the night about the war, about Vogel, about the future. "I think we're the bridge," Reiner said, "between what was and what might still be." Brenner nodded slowly. "Then we better make sure it doesn't collapse." The next morning, when Brenner boarded his train home, he looked out the window at the fields passing by, green, fertile, alive. He realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel like running from his past. He felt like living with it. In another part of the country, Vogel stood on the balcony of his police barracks, watching the sunrise over Stuttgart. The city glowed with promise. Yet beneath the beauty, he sensed the tremor of something unresolved, a history not buried deep enough. Germany was healing, but every scar was a reminder that the body had once been broken. And for men like them, the question remained: were they rebuilding a nation, or merely disguising its wounds? The answer, they knew, would come soon enough. Winter, 1952. The snow came early that year, blanketing Germany in a silence that felt almost ceremonial. Across the rebuilt streets of Frankfurt, the echoes of hammers had given way to church bells and market chatter. The country had entered a new age, an age of reconstruction, prosperity, and forgetting. But not everyone could move on so easily. Beneath the gloss of progress, old ghosts were stirring again, demanding to be seen. Karl Reiner stood before a near-completed apartment complex, hands buried in his coat pockets, eyes tracing the steel and stone he'd helped raise from nothing. He looked older now, not just in years but in weight, as though every beam carried a memory. The world around him had changed faster than he had. Germany had split in two, the Cold War had begun, and talk of the Nazis was now considered impolite, a stain best left untouched. Yet Reiner knew that silence was never neutral. It was a decision. That morning, a man in a dark overcoat approached him at the construction site. The man's accent was clipped, foreign, American. "Mr. Reiner," he said, flashing credentials. "I'm with the CIC. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your wartime service." Reiner had expected this day. The Americans were still hunting, not for ordinary soldiers anymore, but for those who had knowledge. Intelligence, technology, science, anything useful. His name, it seemed, had resurfaced. The officer asked about his unit, about his connections, about rumors that he'd been in charge of sensitive documents that vanished before Germany's surrender. Reiner denied it calmly, truthfully. But the officer's tone suggested he wasn't looking for guilt, he was measuring usefulness. "We could use men like you," the American finally said. "Men who understand discipline. Men who can adapt." Reiner met his gaze. "Adapt to what?" "To a new kind of war," the officer replied, handing him a card. "This time, the enemy's different, but the principles are the same." When he left, Reiner stood for a long time in the falling snow, watching it melt on his gloves. The world was offering him a second uniform, another cause to serve. But he'd worn enough. That night, he burned the card in his stove and watched the paper curl into black ash. Meanwhile, Ernst Vogel was finding himself increasingly out of place in his own department. The post-war police had changed. Younger men were joining, ambitious, confident, unburdened by the war. They called him the old man, though he was barely 40. He still worked meticulously, still believed in order and loyalty, but his colleagues no longer shared his unease about what lay beneath Germany's rebirth. The new Germany wanted clean hands, even if it meant washing away history. One evening, Vogel was summoned to meet a senior officer from Bonn, a man with sharp eyes and an unshakable smile. The conversation began formally but quickly turned pointed. "There are whispers, Ernst," the officer said. "Old files, old loyalties. People who still cling to the past. You understand how delicate our image is." Vogel nodded, unsure where this was heading. The officer leaned closer. "You were seen visiting a certain Karl Reiner in Frankfurt. He's under quiet observation. I'm sure it's nothing, but I'd like to know, Why him? Vogel's pulse quickened. He was a comrade. I wanted to see if he'd adjusted. Adjusted, the man repeated, amused. That's a dangerous word. Tell me, Ernst, have you? The silence between them was sharp. Vogel finally answered, I serve the Republic. The officer smiled thinly. Let's hope so. That night, Vogel realized something he'd resisted admitting. The line between justice and control had blurred again. Different flag, same game. He went home, poured himself a drink, and sat in darkness for hours, staring at his badge. It gleamed dully in the lamplight, a symbol that had begun to feel hollow. Elsewhere, Lucas Brenner was making waves he hadn't intended. His anonymous essays, reflections on guilt, moral responsibility, and the cost of silence, had begun circulating in intellectual circles. One, titled The Soldiers Who Stayed Behind, caught national attention when a prominent newspaper reprinted it. The piece spoke of men who fought for a cause they no longer believed in, men trapped between loyalty and conscience. Public reaction was fierce. Some called it brave. Others called it betrayal. But what mattered most was that it struck a nerve. Letters poured in, some signed, most not. And among them was one that froze Brenner in his tracks. It contained a single line, You speak for those who no longer can. But beware, some of us are still listening. No name. No address. Only the initials EV at the bottom. Brenner's mind flashed instantly to Vogel. They hadn't spoken since 1949. Could it be a warning? A test? Or something darker? He debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. He arranged to meet Vogel through a mutual acquaintance in a quiet tavern outside Stuttgart. When they met, both men looked older, more tired. The air between them was cautious. You read my essays? Brenner said. I did, Vogel replied. And so did others. You're stirring ghosts, Lucas. Dangerous ones. Maybe they need stirring, Brenner said quietly. We buried too much. Vogel sighed. You think the world wants truth? It wants order. It wants to believe the war was a nightmare that ended when the sun rose. But it didn't. It just changed shape. And you? Brenner asked. What do you believe now? Vogel hesitated, then leaned closer. I believe someone's trying to use men like Reiner again. The Americans, the Soviets, everyone's fishing in the same pond. They all want what we used to know, strategies, networks, loyalties. The war didn't end, Lucas. It just went underground. Brenner frowned. And Reiner? He's refusing them, Vogel said. But refusal has a cost. A week later, that cost arrived. Reiner's apartment was found ransacked, papers scattered, stove cold, no sign of him. Witnesses claimed they saw two men in dark coats leaving late at night. The police filed a report, but nothing came of it. When Vogel received the news, he knew what it meant. Someone had decided Reiner's usefulness had expired. He went to Frankfurt under the pretense of investigating, though he already suspected he was too late. All he found was Reiner's notebook, a small, leather-bound journal left behind on a shelf. Inside were notes, sketches, fragments of thought, reflections on rebuilding, forgiveness, and one final entry that read simply, Truth is the only victory left. Vogel took the notebook home, unsure whether it was a relic or a responsibility. That night, he contacted Brenner. When they met again, Vogel handed him the journal. He wanted to remember, Vogel said. You're better at that than I am. Tell his story. Tell ours. Brenner opened it slowly, fingers trembling. The pages smelled of dust and smoke. He read the final line aloud. Truth is the only victory left. He looked up. Then we tell it. All of it. Vogel nodded. But carefully. The world has short patience for complicated heroes. Over the next months, Brenner worked tirelessly, turning Reiner's notes into a manuscript, part memoir, part confession, part warning. It was not a tale of heroes and villains but of men who lived in the gray between. He titled it The Ashes We Built Upon. It was published quietly in 1953, under a pseudonym, but its impact rippled across a country desperate for meaning. Critics called it haunting, dangerous, necessary. And then, one night in early spring, Vogel was found dead in his car outside Stuttgart, an apparent suicide. The note he left was brief: "We serve too many masters. Let history judge the rest." When Brenner read the news, he didn't cry. He simply walked to his desk, opened Reiner's journal again, and wrote beneath the final line, "And if truth is victory, then silence is surrender." Years later, historians would debate the book's origins: who wrote it, who it truly described. Some said it was a composite, a symbolic work rather than literal truth. Others swore it was real, a chronicle of the quiet war fought by those who survived the loud one. But for those who had lived through it, the message was unmistakable. Redemption was not in denial but in acknowledgement. In the end, Reiner's notebook vanished into archives. Brenner disappeared into quiet anonymity. And Germany kept building, taller, cleaner, brighter. Yet beneath every foundation, beneath every monument, there remained the bones of memory. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the streets of Frankfurt, it carried faint echoes, hammer strikes, laughter, gunfire, all blurred into the same rhythm. The rhythm of a nation learning, at last, that the past never truly ends. It only waits for someone brave enough to speak it aloud. And as the screen fades to black, a voice, calm, reflective, and human, speaks the final words. History does not forgive or forget. It watches. It waits. And it reminds us that what we bury will one day dig its way back into the light. If you've journeyed this far with us through the silence and the shadows, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts below. Because remembering, that's how we win the only victory left.